Hey, what's up, everyone? It's Zach, and welcome to the FairlyOdd Cast. The goal of this first episode is just to act like any other introductory installment of anything, and just kind of lay out the broad topics that we'll be exploring throughout, and just kind of like lay out the structure of how an episode will go. There'll be like a topic that I'll have in mind, but a lot of times will end up talking to people because I just enjoy talking to people in general rather than just like ranting to myself about a topic. But there are a group of just topics that I'm naturally interested in, like aesthetics, technology, philosophy, economics, because I think economics affects everyone, and you can also talk about economics super specifically, like we're doing in this episode, which is about NFTs. And if you're not familiar with what NFTs stands for Non Fungible Token, and that's just a way of representing value on the blockchain. And to get a little bit more specific from that, the word fungible pretty much just means that it's like not interchangeable with another. So if you go to a bank, for instance, with traditional fungible representation of value, you can give them a $20 bill, right? And they can give you 4 5s or 2 10s or a different $20 bill, and none of those matter to you. And that is fungible, right? It's like interchangeable with any other as long as it has the same value. In this episode, we're talking about non-fungible. And in a technical sense, there's ways of representing fungible value and non-fungible value on the blockchain. Like Bitcoin would be more of like the gold or the traditional value, like more of a fungible because there's a limited amount. And more things built on different platforms, like for instance Ethereum, which is probably the most popular for NFTs. It allows you to embed anything within that like transaction. So you can do any sort of media or code within this, can be within this non-fungible item. And I'm just paying that to say, like, even a lot of the popular ones right now, for instance, are super collectible, like almost like a basketball card would be in the 70s, 80s, 90s. Now they're able to embed a full highlight within this NFT. So it's like you just have a traditional card, like it might be a LeBron James highlight. So it might have LeBron James's name and his number at the bottom, and then it might show like a highlight that he had this season, and that might sell for a certain, I'm not sure the sell amount on those because that's not my wheelhouse, which gets kind of specifically to this episode. We're going to be focusing more on the art aspect of it. There's a lot of different angles that you can come at this from because it is such a versatile thing. Like I said, you can embed any sort of media or code. So that like blows open, you know what I'm saying, possibilities out the wazoo. So like this isn't supposed to be some all-encompassing guide. This is just my specific perspective and how I think that affects like the broader aspect of like issues in the economy. For instance, one topic that we'll tackle closer to the end is the environmental effects of crypto in general, but also specifically NFTs, because this is obviously a very socially aware space. So a lot of people, this has just been a very popular topic, right? Or a very popular topic of conversation around the space. A lot of people are very conflicted on whether you should even like make NFTs. So that's going to be something that obviously it affects everyone, but we're going to be looking more specifically at how artists kind of move in that space, and I'll probably have like some differing opinions from the consensus, but that's fine. And the last preface before we jump into the meat of this episode is just to kind of explain the title. Metamodern mediums is a title that I'm going to recycle a lot, probably for just a couple episodes on this, and then it's the title of an essay that's going to be in one of my upcoming books called The Postmodern Condition, and pretty much the essay is just about the current mediums that we see being utilized in the culture nowadays. Like there's been a resurgence in records and vinyl and writing and a lot of just old texts and things like that. So I'm kind of also looking at new mediums, old mediums, and just like the current landscape of mediums, the topology of mediums within that essay. And in doing so, one of the like more lengthy notes within the essay is about NFTs. And so I kind of had to dive pretty deep into the space over the past couple months. And just to also preface the preface a little bit, I don't own any NFTs or anything, and I'm not like invested in the space. So I don't have anything personally to like make off the topic so far. Like I'm not against making NFTs, so it's not something I'm rolling out in the future, but just saying like this isn't some pitch for me to say like, hey, buy my NFT. I'm more just interested in the subject, like it's just kind of interesting, and really just the broad social implications. Like it gets super interesting thinking about how those things are going to play out and how it'll affect the contemporary art space as a whole, how it affects economics, it'll affect gaming, and probably just a majority of what the internet is built on will be some sort of smart contract in some form. So it'll just be interesting to see how NFTs play a role in that transformation, if NFTs are around for the long haul or they're just transformative technology for the more immediate future. To kind of transition a little bit, and also to give a little context to a word I keep repeating over and over: medium. A medium is just a way of expressing an idea, right? So if you have something in your head, a way of just bringing it to life is the medium you use. That's the loose definition that I'm going to use for everything without going into too much semantics or philosophy or ontology or anything specific. And to play off that, I want to frame why NFTs are important with a quote by Marshall McLuhan, which is a Canadian media theorist. And he repeats over and over that the medium is the message. And this is probably the most overused quote ever. But I want to use it very ironically because it is used over and over and over and over. But that's because it is the point. Like, it needs to be used in that way. And it just means that the manner in which we receive our information should be the topic of discussion rather than the actual content. Because the content's going to adapt to the form of the medium. So, like, you can't get a picture through radio waves. A radio program is bound more to the specific waves that it is traveling through more than anything the actual program can do. So yes, you could compare shock jockeys. You could compare Howard Stern's shock jockey prime time, the peak of his success, when everyone is stuck in the car for hours commuting. You could compare that with 1920s radio, right? It would be very conservative in contrast. But those two have way more in common than they have a difference, right? So they're bound so much by the specific form that they're in. Like, yes, you can alternate the way you say things. You can alternate the specifics of how you're saying something. But really, it's just bound by the way the information is packaged. And that's why NFTs are so important. Because like I alluded to a while ago, it really fundamentally has the potential, blockchain technology in general, but specifically NFTs, because they allow you to transfer any media or code. So that just, if we're thinking about like the bounds of something, like what is the bounds of words as a medium? What is the bounds of a page as medium, right? And then what is the bounds like past that? Like when the camera happened, like we know, well, a lot of people are aware of the turn that made in contemporary art at the time. When the camera came along, it completely changed painting, right? Because it was like, why try to capture reality when a camera can already do it better? A similar transformation took place before this with the printing press, and then more recently with the invention of cinema, obviously. The type of story that you can tell within a piece of film is drastically different than you can tell within a single photograph or within a book. Like something like Inception, just the composition of the frames visually, the color grading, the voice, the textures of the voice, the textures of the audio, like all these things combined, although like there's an argument to be made that you can get a more rich experience by limiting the senses. Like a book, you're having to just interpret the language off the page, so there's no visualization, no audio. Or music, where it's all audio and there's no visualization, so any story you have to completely visualize. Dimensionality of the medium matters a lot, right? So the amount that you can store within a medium drastically determines what you can do within the medium, right? And so tying it back into art, being able to embed any sort of medium or code is drastically going to change the things artists can create, and it's going to change how artists' work is distributed. So it's going to change the very relationship between an artist and their work. So for instance, it's going to be so much easier to license out work, because thanks to technology, once you have the process, you can just completely automate the output, right? Like you can get an infinite supply of digital goods. Like as soon as you just make something, you can have infinite copies. So it's easy for artists to just make money off of licensing and stuff like this, because their work can be in multiple places at one time, and it doesn't take any overhead. No person has to be actively out there selling it. There's just these places that passively bring it in. Now, obviously, they are limited by the platforms and the marketplaces that are able to get their work seen and the exposure and all that. So obviously they are limited by the platforms they're on just like anything else. But the thing is that artists don't have to actually create a bunch of this stuff from the ground up. It's already there, and because the competition is so high, there's all these platforms. Like even within the NFT space, you have 5 or 6 platforms that are all kind of gunning right now to be the marketplace for NFTs. And so it really comes down to who's giving people the best offer, who's charging the least on gas, who's optimizing the best, who has the best user interface, who is getting actual artists' work seen that wants to be seen, actually converting people, actually making it easier for people to actually buy things, like not putting a bunch of barriers to where customers fall off through the funnel. And there probably will be a consolidation where 1 or 2 platforms will hold the 1 and 2 spot, like we see with Bitcoin and Ethereum, or even like in social media where you see like Facebook, and which is Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. You probably will see a sharp consolidation, but there will always be that marketplace there that if people get too frustrated with the platform, there's always the ability to just create a derivative project from that, which is also going to be something we just spend time on. But you can just create a product that's similar to that, change it a little bit, improve on the design, and then offer it to the marketplace as a new product. And yes, there is a barrier of entry for people, like a burden upon the people of like switching to platforms, which is like obviously hard. But the thought is, if the platform isn't performing, then there'll be like this built up surplus energy that will motivate the consumer to move platforms, which will also be good for the artist. And the artists will have some say in this too, because artists are having more and more charge of their personal brand. So that you can even see parallels in this in the music industry. Tidal was an important component within artists negotiating their cuts within streams and how much of a percentage that each artist gets of stream, and kind of set the stage by giving artists like stock in the company and everything like that. And this was possible because there was a marketplace amongst these brands like competing, but also because the artist had so much leverage of their brand, right? Artists could go directly to Twitter and complain and say, these are the percentages I'm getting. These are crazy. This is the amount my label's charging me for traditional advertising, but my label doesn't have a digital strategy for advertising. Like, it gave the artist the ability to be able to represent themselves in the public sphere, which is able to affect their ability to negotiate within the marketplace. And we see that a ton now in a lot of different forms. Boycott this, or we want to buy from here, like please buy my music from this platform. You see a lot of people favoring Bandcamp or pushing Bandcamp into the musical space now because of its relationships with its terms within the artist, like the percentages and everything. And the exact same thing is taking place within the NFT space. It's always taking place within the art marketplace. Like, you always want the representation that gets you the most bang for your buck, takes the least percentage, all this stuff. But after a while, it gets very institutionalized, and there becomes all these social norms or norms within the marketplace, like, oh, a manager just gets 20% or 40%, like that's just how it is. A gallery just takes 30% for a sale. That's just the standard. Or if I remember correctly, I think Christie's charges like 20% unless it's over like 2 million or something, and then it goes down, or it goes down like across the spectrum over that or something to like 5%. I'm not sure, but either way, there is these like institutionalized standards, and anytime a new medium comes out or a new platform, there's obviously like a huge renegotiation period. So, and we've actually been seeing the online art marketplace slowly creep in each year on percentage on traditional galleries and everything. And NFTs is just something that's accelerating that to such a degree, it's crazy. And you're even starting to see a bunch of these traditional galleries and stuff try to get involved in it. But even just within the NFT space, you see such a competition just between the platforms on who can optimize best for the artist and who can deliver best for the artist. So right now there's a huge competition for who can optimize the best for like gas for an artist. So whenever you create an NFT, I'm not 100% sure how it works, but a percentage of it, this is what I'm not sure of. I'm not sure what percentage, but a percentage of the ether that is used to create the NFT is destroyed, and in its place is created this new thing that is this NFT. So it's like you took a piece of money or something and then were able to like smush it into a painting or something to like notarize it. So there is like less ether in the world because of it. So it creates a smaller supply of ether, and so it creates a higher demand. Or if demand is high just because people are investing in a lot in Ethereum in general, well, then it gets super expensive to create the artwork because the ether is worth a lot more because there's more demand. So it gets really nerdy around how the platforms are optimized and how Ethereum in general is optimized and the updates that'll be coming to Ethereum in the future, Ethereum 2.0, and all the different like roll downs or all the different things that they're planning on implementing, that because it's a network effect and because we're dealing with computers, these all have exponential effects. So each update will have an effect of hundreds of times or hundreds of thousands of times of improvement in speed and efficiency. And this isn't correlated to Moore's law or anything, or just saying like, hey man, we're just going to get bigger computers so it'll all work out, because that would tie very strongly negatively into the environmental aspect, because obviously faster computers most of the time require a higher amount of energy. This is separate from Moore's law. This is just on the software side. So it's going to create this big of an impact just by changing a few key features within the architecture of the protocols. And now that I'm thinking about it, there probably is like a nuance point around like faster computers don't always mean more energy, but you know what I mean? It's not like we're sure just going to overpower this problem or just increase processing power is going to make a difference. It's really just the way that the systems are laid out are going to make a vast change in like how it actually operates as a whole. So for instance, like Ethereum, which is what most NFTs are built off of, like I said, is planning on moving from a proof of work model to a proof of stake model. And that just gets very complicated and nuanced, and it's not really worth going down the specifics of it right now, but you can look that up definitely. The point is just that it's going to vastly, because of the way that the transactions are actually taking place and the way value is proved across the system, it's going to drastically affect the amount of transactions, the type of transactions, and the cost of those transactions, which leads to kind of the current state of the marketplace. And then we'll get into where I think it's headed. Where I think it's at now is that gas is very expensive because of these changes that haven't happened to Ethereum yet, and also the price varies a little bit depending on the time of day. So for instance, if you were to go buy a cup of coffee in the middle of the night with Ethereum, it could charge you maybe $50 in fees. If you were to go at like peak busy time of, and I'm not sure when that is, it could charge you $80. And that's not a hyperbole. Those are like real numbers, like close to real numbers, ballpark at least, for just a cup of coffee. Now, minting an NFT can cost somewhere between $80, and that's without even destroying the Ethereum. That's just the processing of it. So if you're creating an NFT, which like I said is destroying part of the Ethereum to create this NFT, it can cost between like somewhere like $80 to like, I saw like 200 at one point, which is just crazy, obviously. And the bad part about this is that most NFTs aren't going to sell for a lot of money or age very well in value. So a lot of this wealth will kind of accumulate at the top of the NFT market. But it's obviously impossible for anyone to say, hey, don't create NFTs right now, because like the first manuscripts printed on the printing press or anything else, there is a lot of value just in being the first, and artists want to be able to capitalize off their work. So it's hard to tell artists, hey, don't do this because the fees are high, when you could equally make a shit ton more than you've ever made off your art. But the marketplace is definitely very competitive right now, and you see all over Reddit right now, people just constantly minting their first one, minting their first one, minting their first one. And equally, you see a ton of people complaining about gas, complaining about their work not selling, and at the same time, within a contemporary art subreddit or something, or within the contemporary art space on Instagram and Twitter, you're seeing people say, oh, this is just a complete pyramid scheme to like accumulate wealth around a couple key like bullshit art. Like, I'm not using the word bullshit to say like looking like bullshit or abstract. I'm saying a lot of people view it as just kind of kitsch, right? So for instance, the two most popular kind of groups of artwork, like collections right now of artwork, is CryptoPunks and CryptoKitties, but it's because they were some of the very first created. CryptoPunks, for example, has very much an 8-bit style, which, although it probably does appeal to the gaming community or the crypto art community in general a little more than just the general public's aesthetical tastes, it's definitely not something that, like, overall a vast amount of people would vote as the quote-unquote best art. But we even see that kind of, like, equaling itself out. So, for instance, if you say, like, oh, it's just a pyramid scheme that's based off bad art, I would point to Beeple, who at the time of recording this podcast still has a day left of his Christie's auction, And it's for 5,000 of his first images, which may seem like a lot, but he creates one every day within Cinema 4D. And they're photorealistic and they're amazing. And the bid is currently up to 10 million. And he hasn't been rewarded through any of the traditional gallery structures or anything like that for years and years and years and years. Like, he's been doing these dailies for 13 years now. And although a lot of people within the 3D space, like myself, like I saw him on The Future for the first time a couple of years ago, but even like MoGraph conventions, the MoGraph podcast, like there's all these different places that have recognized him, but not the traditional art world. And yes, he has had opportunities to make money, but nowhere near the value of his actual art. Nowhere near $10 million. There's people that have did way less, both conceptually, both hard work, both dedication, and even just aesthetical value that haven't put as much. So in the same token, you can say, hey man, CryptoKitties are kind of shit. I can say, yeah, but also like the first Bible that was probably printed on the printing press is pretty shit and it's worth a lot of money now. And Beeple's pretty dope. So any structure that I think I can like project over time and see it rewarding more Beeples than I do CryptoPunks, I think that's a good structure. Now, the part of that claim that is up in the air is if in the long term it rewards artists like that, which that is when no one can predict the future. And I'm not exactly 100% sure on that either. I can make my bets, but I'm not 100% sure. But no matter what, because of its potential, I think it's worth keeping an eye on because it has the potential to address a lot of the problems that are present as artists try to negotiate their place within the market. And it's also rightful to ask, like, hey, what are the problems within the traditional infrastructure that are keeping artists from doing this? And is there a better way to do this than NFTs or something? Which, to address that problem, I think we kind of need to look at copyright and derivative work, intellectual property in general, like how artists relate to the things that they own. And we'll also look at the problems which NFTs are supposed to be the thesis to solve. Then we'll lay out arguments that people may give for why you shouldn't make NFTs or how that's not the right way to solve the problems or potential hazards that could bring about that are greater than the original problem. And then after we lay those out, we'll attempt to come to some sort of synthesis, like some sort of opinion on how one should operate optimally, logistically, and ethically within the NFT space, kind of my predictions about it. And in doing so, I think it's also important to do like this meta layer of like explaining the structure of the argumentation, explain pretty much like the form in which I'm thinking and which I'm laying out the thinking when approaching this problem. So although this conversation is about NFTs, I also want to make it a good exercise in actually thinking and breaking down problems, which will be something that is true about every episode. It'll be a lot more about the actual process of exploring the topic than it is actually the specific topic. Like it'll be an exercise of thought throughout the public. Like it'll just be dialogue that's supposed to be me interacting with this thing that we call the society, the public, that thing out there that is everyone else. It's a way of like bouncing ideas off that as a sounding board and using time and the medium of audio to capture my thinking and kind of like use that even as a retrospective soundboard for myself to just look at like, oh, this is how I was thinking and this is how I approached that topic, because it's easy to just remember conclusions but not as much how you're breaking down the topic. And speaking of breaking down, I know I keep saying bringing in words like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and this is just the basis of Hegelian dialectic, and if you're not familiar with that, it's not that big a deal. Once again, you can kind of look that up, but it's just kind of me showing the mental math behind what I am thinking, and even if you're not familiar with what exactly it is, I'm sure it'll only take a couple times of me mentioning it, and you'll be like, okay, it's not not rocket surgery or anything, just a basic way of like breaking down. Like I said, you form a thesis to a problem. That's pretty normal. Like you might phrase it as hypothesis in science, but for philosophical explorations, we're just going to use synthesis. And the most basic problem that we're forming a thesis from is the problem with intellectual property. And first you have to define what is intellectual property. So before there was any laws about ideas or anything, say you had an idea for an axe or some sort of technology for like a house or something, you know, something like a roof that is slanted or something that allows the rain to fall off. Or realizing that if you put some sort of like way for the water to flow down, that it doesn't affect the foundation, like gutters and everything, like early versions of that. This technology could easily just be seen and then maybe explained a little bit with words like, hey, why do you have the water running down like that? Or why do you have the roof positioned like that? Or whatnot. And the person could say like, hey, because I did this, then the house fell, and then I tried this, and then it worked. And then that person goes, oh, that's a good idea. And then they do it, and then it spreads, and the idea just kind of spreads throughout the human collective unconscious or the public. But eventually we decided to start putting a value on these things. So, which makes sense. If I have an idea and everyone benefits from it, why shouldn't I get rewarded for that idea? That way I can sustain myself while I'm trying to produce other ideas, because although it didn't have necessarily a profound effect, maybe like, for instance, sticking with the roofing design of early houses, this isn't something that necessarily affects one person a lot, but it affects a ton of different people and affects them like compoundingly throughout history. So with the resources or the avoidance of tragedy that comes from like not having a house collapse or something, isn't something that can be measured and is going to allow the person that had that idea to sustain themselves. So they're not really rewarded for that and aren't incentivized to come up with more ideas. So eventually we decided to incentivize those ideas and reward it, right? Because we want to get better and better ideas, and we want to push people more in that direction to innovate. So we said, okay, ideas are essentially non-fungible, right? If I have an idea and you have an idea, we can't exchange those ideas. Like, those are unique ideas. They're not the same. Like, we can't put equal value to all those because they have vastly different effects. And so you should be able to own your idea. And so we set up a system of being able to claim intellectual property. And this is done through patents, trademarks, and copyright. And you can look those up to get the specific meaning of each one. But pretty much, it just gave creators just the exclusive right to reproduce and distribute the work, right? So you own that, and you get to decide how many times it's duplicated, you get to decide what it's used for, and how it's distributed. And obviously this sets up like a competitive architecture to it. Like, obviously the more ideas that are produced, you can't grab someone else's idea, so obviously it's kind of like a hierarchy of ideas. You keep having to semi-progress up into more complicated ideas, and that the easier ideas probably are already thought of or already patented. And where it gets even a little bit more competitive is when you realize that a bunch of these are really just targeting math. Like, a bunch of software is really just like an approach or handling of numbers. And because of the way math works and just kind of propagates throughout the ethos, like logically building off each other, it's hard to tell if you're necessarily stumbling over someone's copyright. And so you end up having these just large companies that just collect a bunch of this copyright and then just sit around waiting to sue people. Which gets us to the contemporary context of intellectual property as far as it relates to like economics. Only certain large companies ever actually get sued for these things. It's only the IBMs and Microsofts that get sued. It's never, like, no single developer, someone that small, has anything worth taking if you're one of these huge copyright companies. And the larger businesses being the ones that are able to actually pursue all the copyright cases, because copyright cases can be incredibly expensive after you track the amount of resources it takes to find the perpetrator and then actually like represent yourself in court. Which leads to another hole in intellectual property, is that some inventions are just so fundamental to the human well-being that we have to socialize the cost, or else it won't get done. Or the people that actually make the discoveries essentially have to just give them away, because there's no way that humanity can almost repay it, or there's not a structure intact to be able to reward that. So off the bat, some of the worst intellectual property deals made between people in history happened within physics, because there's so many fundamental things that physics discovers that just radiates throughout how we think of life and how everything relates to reality. Like, literally, you can't copyright that, you can't patent that, you can't trademark that. So at a philosophical level, we're forced to go back to the intellectual property framing and say, like, what actually does produce big C creativity? What does produce innovation that does further the public welfare? Like, everyone's being in this world. And how do we handle everything in between? How do we handle small c creativity? And how do we tell the difference? And how do we just foster an overall creative environment? Like, for instance, one thing that's very popular and easy to see within this context is the topic of derivative works. So, for instance, everyone knows the Hope Obama Shepard Fairey poster, the one that's like blue and red. And I'm sure equally a lot of people are also aware that the artist was sued for using a photograph. And there's an argument to be made of it being derivative work as something that is built upon that, yes, but it adds something new and is a brand new creation. And although it does nod its head to that, it is something completely different. So that is a type of derivative work. Another more contemporary context that we see this within is a lot within music, for instance, covers. Or in rap music, there's mixtapes that often use other people's beats. For instance, like Lil Wayne, his dedication series of mixtapes made this very popular. And although New York and other places didn't do that as much, Lil Wayne's popularity made that such a big thing, and everyone started doing it as a way to express themselves. And it was a way of the public expressing themselves. It's what they liked, and they expressed that through the market. They bought it, they listened to it, they streamed it. But that's when it got complicated. And there was huge industries built just on like using other people's works, rapping on other people's beats, and then putting that out. A lot of times for like just the price of the CD or for free online. And this like finally accumulated with DJ Drama going to jail for selling all these mixtapes and stuff. But then once actually they got the intellectual property backing behind all this down, like once the labels had a chance to actually like, okay, where does the money go for this beat? How does the producer get paid from the original song? How do the original people get paid? And then how does this person like capitalize off this mixtape version, this version of the song that they're rapping on that is this original person's beat? And so once they got all the logistics worked out, now everyone can have mixtapes. But DJ Drama went to jail for this. So it just shows how much of a difference the actual atmosphere and the creative laws actually matter within the things people are creating, and how the intellectual property laws can actually hinder what people are actually wanting to create and what is authentically wanting to be expressed. Furthermore, if you dive into that a little bit more, even a lot of times currently within the contracts of current artists, a mixtape doesn't count towards their contract. So although a lot of people get paid, the original author may get paid, the label's getting paid for the streams, the artist doesn't really get rewarded for this mixtape. So it's like they socialize the risk and individualize the benefits to the label. And this just goes to show that like, so although a lot of these laws and thoughts behind ownership is meant to reward the artist, a lot of times it creates like an opportunity for businesses to sit on top of artists and take advantage of them. Or in engineering terms, it's just an additional degree of freedom that's unnecessary. And that's pretty much the problem. But this is where NFTs come in as a potential thesis, a potential hypothesis, a potential solution, right? Because the digital world allows us to infinitely iterate on things like processes, so much of this can be automated, which doesn't seem like a lot until you see the massive hindrance that it can have on the generator function of innovation throughout a whole society, right? If you're affecting something at the core function of what is creating the innovation, its effects are going to be exponential. Like, it's hard to quantify the exact effects that the semiconductor or telecom communications had, because those just reverberate throughout many things. Like, it accumulates into the iPhone now. But even like the lineage of intellectual property that it left behind before it accumulates into this amazing invention. So problem with the current framework of intellectual property, and there's a variety of ways that people are going about tackling that. NFTs tries to affect the generator function of how we create, how intellectual property is distributed. And this is a strategy that's used widely across the digital space. For instance, SingularityNet, this is the approach they take to algorithms also. You should allow people to upload and distribute and own their work, and that actually reverberates throughout the collective unconscious of like actually promoting innovation in people to build on top of things, which gets us back to the derivative work and the sort of laws and walls of the laws that people are running up against in the current intellectual property architecture. Like, for instance, TikTok. Every TikTok video has a song associated with it. So how much of that new creation of the TikTok should be owned by the artist, how much should be owned by the performer that is making the visuals, and how much should be owned by TikTok. These are all questions that have to be answered. And so the thing about NFTs is it attempts to decentralize a bunch of this decision making and decentralize the burden of the decision making and almost the things that can go wrong. So just by automating it, artists know what they're getting, people know what they're getting by buying it, and it doesn't take a lot of like middlemen or like laws and time trying to figure it out, like the mixtape example with DJ Drama, Lil Wayne, and the labels using mixtapes now. It really just took time to really incorporate that into the system and be able to process the whole thing and recognize everyone's contributions and make sure everyone's rewarded. But that big delay actually stifles innovation. And this is why NFTs are kind of the thesis that a lot of people have come up with for this intellectual property problem. If we decentralize some of this and take away some of the decision making that has to be done, then it takes away the burden of it. It does take away a little bit of the freedom, but it also takes away the burden. And if you're building platforms, addressing the freedom part, if you're building platforms in a marketplace which these platforms are competing, like Ethereum, like you have all these things on the blockchain that are different protocols of how NFTs or anything could relate to each other, how information is just relating. Well, then if one is doing bad, another one should be able to rise and create a derivative work off that, and the users should reward the better platform with their business in an actual competitive market. Now, this gets down to like a lot of nuanced things, like what is an actual competitive market and what is that balance between freedom and autonomy that maximizes the benefit of the artist. Like how many middlemen of actually physical people do you need in between to protect the artist? Yes, you kind of do need someone at the top of the platform, so you feel like someone has the wheel. Like someone needs to be running Ethereum and whatnot, so it doesn't feel like it's just a machine we let loose to regulate all these things. But we want to decrease the amount of friction of innovation. So it's like how Twitter balances for almost the maximum amount of outrage by keeping your sentences short and everything. That's almost what we have to do with these platforms, is find this balance that produces the maximum amount of innovation. And this is done by just creating systems and tweaking it and seeing how people react and giving people the ability to actually mold these platforms to what they want to do. Which is why the blockchain technology in general is so cool, because you can build on top of it and it creates this kind of competitive architecture for people to compete, like the App Store or internet. And getting to the antithesis, not having these barriers in between of actually people or galleries or things like that, isn't allowing like human ingenuity, like gallery owners and stuff, to spot out these great upcoming talent and really reward it and foster it. But I'd argue that a lot of these platforms are already kind of rising to that challenge. Like Nifty Gateway is exclusive, right? And so only a certain amount of artists are let in. And yes, it is semi-top artists, but there's also ways of applying and getting in and allowing them to like bring up a talent that may otherwise be overlooked. So for instance, in the traditional gallery setting, you take a top gallery like Christie's, they may have an application or something, or have a recommendation to check out an artist that is super underrated in the attention from the broad public, but they may bring on their work and then sell it in an attempt to give that artist more recognition and things like that. But also because it helps out the gallery, it's underpriced attention for them. It's easy for them to take up this unknown person than it would be to actually like have it compete against other galleries, against more well-known artists, and compete for their business with like percentages and stuff. But this structure is in place in these platforms like Nifty Gateway. There is ways of applying and is ways of bringing up those artists and giving them a lot of attention. Arguably, these platforms like Nifty Gateway actually do a better job than traditional galleries of bringing those artists up, because yes, you do have the human ingenuity available in Nifty Gateway, that they're able to manually process the applications and really make decisions on a person-by-person basis of what artists they want to bring in. But once the artist is on that platform, they have an algorithm running the front page of like Nifty Gateway and a lot of these platforms that rewards the best art. The art that people want to see and people want to buy gets rewarded and being shown to people. Now, yes, you do have instances like Amazon where it's them favoring their products, which is a huge problem, which is why a lot of these processes need to be decentralized, or the public need to be aware of the algorithms or be able to take control of these algorithms in the way these are processed. But I digress. My point is that you can't really fake what something sells for on like a Christie's auction, but you can choose what gets displayed at certain times, what is auctioned at certain times, what is included in certain shows. And this is what this new technology and new platforms have to address. And so I don't really see the argument that the galleries are offering something that these platforms platforms can't, as a plausible antithesis. Now, that gets us to a more plausible antithesis, which is the environmental aspects, which takes a little bit of picking apart. And a lot of the talk of NFTs is about the environmental aspect, because if you go through a lot of the numbers, which I'm not going to necessarily just overly quote a bunch here or anything, because I think it's more should be about the broad philosophical, like ethical implications behind this, so it should be able to be stretched, like the argument has to be stretched in either direction to the extremes and really like hold weight more than just the specific nuance to how the numbers relate to each other. For instance, how we measure and what we measure has a large impact on the numbers that people are actually citing. And I'm not going to sit here and say, like, okay, everything averages out completely. But a lot of things that people don't take into account is the physical environmental impact that a lot of these traditional galleries or traditional ways of selling work actually has as a trade-off. If people are creating digital art, which is what a lot of the NFTs are, you have to also look at what people would be doing to sell that work anyway. So for instance, a lot of people would go on Reddit and all these online forums and promote their work. And then they get physical versions printed or manufactured through drop shipping companies. Not saying anything's wrong with any of this or unethical. My only point is that all this line of things that has the potential to impact the environment, like the paper that it's printed on is probably made from trees, like the acrylics and the paint and everything probably has waste that ends up going in the ocean and stuff like that. You could look at all these things and look at it for traditional, you could look at it for digital, but the point is there's going to be a marketplace and there's going to be an amount of energy spent on that. So we can make an argument for or against, like, okay, but what is that amount of energy? Like, obviously, art isn't important as food, so you'd want to spend more energy on that as a society, like you'd be willing to. So it's about finding that balance, the nuance where we're fine spending this amount of energy on this. And this is where a lot of people do have problems with NFTs, is that NFTs do use a lot of energy because of the proof of work versus proof of stake models that we were talking about earlier. Because it's a proof of work model and decentralized, it's having to live on a bunch of different computers at once. So it's having to make calculations on like a shit ton of computers, where if you're just making the calculation on one computer, it saves amount of processing power and energy. It's not as secure, obviously, because it's not all these computers as like backups to each other or whatever, but it's a lot less energy. So there is a trade-off there. And it's worth looking at who's on each side of that trade, because it's all about the goal of creating maximum innovation, because that's going to be what ends up solving something like a climate crisis, is us being able to innovate our way around it, like come up with renewable resources, come up with or like ways of harnessing renewable resources, or just other ways of innovating around it. So when we look at like mediums and how they limit public creativity, we have to value how much is this going to impede innovation that's actually going to hurt the long-term goals, even though we may be hurting the long-term goal to get there. So although using energy may not be a public good, there is also the decentralization and how that's going to foster innovation. So it has to be balanced. How much energy are we willing to spend to decentralize the system, and what is the potential for that system? Like, for instance, I mentioned earlier, moving from a proof of work to a proof of stake model could have exponential impacts on the speed and the amount of energy used. And equally, the updates on the specific protocols like Ethereum, or the specific things they keep rolling out, like the pull-ups, which is just a fancy way of saying like they're bundling data together. All these innovations have such a compound effect because it's in the digital world, like I said earlier, 100 times, 100,000 times speed increases. That's completely impossible in real life. Like, you're never going to decrease the amount of plastic we're using on paints 100,000 times. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's virtually impossible unless we just create something that is completely renewable, which is just some sort of new innovation. So we also have to look at the potential of the system. Does making an NFT cost a significantly more amount of energy than most things right now? Yes, but I would argue that because the stock itself and the value of Ethereum is going up so much anyway, it is punishing the artists and the actually creators, because it's not just artists that is creating things within this realm. It's everything being built on these smart contracts and everything. So just by telling some people like, hey, don't do this because it hurts the environment a little bit more than the structures that are already oppressing you, it's hard to make that negotiation. You can't tell someone who has never sold a piece of work before because they work in digital art, or maybe they don't have a degree or any sort of recognition going in, or furthermore, maybe their actual physical location is somewhere that doesn't foster creativity, somewhere where art galleries aren't a thing. They're not welcome in a gallery or something, or don't get appointments. The meritocracy of this decentralized system allows them to compete and sell art for thousands and thousands of dollars if they've never even sold a piece of art before, which is crazy. And it's hard to tell someone like, hey, but that's hurting the environment. So you should think about all 7 billion people in the world before you think about like how you're paying your bills. It is a balance. So you don't want to impede on innovation, but you also don't want to hurt the public. So my thought is that something like this, where it has the potential to decrease in energy consumption so much over time, and is something that is worth investing in and worth giving people the opportunity to innovate around. Furthermore, even the thought of just high energy consumption isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like I said earlier, there's a certain amount of things we just have to spend energy on because they require movements of information, and that just requires some sort of power. The big problem is, especially in cryptocurrency, is that a majority of the cryptocurrency mining that's being done is being done on highly pollutant coal power plants, a majority of them in China. And that is obviously a problem. But I don't think that's an inherent thing of saying it's using too much energy. Yes, creative acts and being able to share information around the globe in a centralized way. The internet itself uses a shit ton of energy. You could argue like, hey, this whole internet thing, we're going to shut that down until we figure out what the hell's going on. You know what I'm saying? Like, you could take that approach, but I don't know if that's going to actually get you closer to solving a climate crisis or get you farther away, because we all know the amount of innovation that happens on the internet is mind-blowing. And we also don't want to make it where that system only rewards the least ethical behavior. A boycott or something, or telling everyone like, hey, if you believe in climate change, don't invest in NFTs, that creates it where to want to make money in the space, or anyone who does, immediately is pitted against that movement. So, and like the internet, there is this network effect where the more people that do invest and the more people that do create on the platform, it fosters innovation on the platform itself. Obviously, if all the users drop off of a platform like Ethereum, they're not going to update it as much, and they're not going to have as much resources behind that innovation. And like we said earlier, these innovations do happen at an exponential scale, unlike a lot of things that can happen in physical reality. So this combination of environmental aspects and the problems that could go wrong with the gallery is kind of the antithesis, and that was kind of me working through my thoughts behind each point. And yes, I do think that both of those need to be taken into account. That is the synthesis. I think that if you're moving within the NFT space or moving within the crypto space in general, climate crisis needs to be one of the first things on your mind, in my opinion, because it does have a drastic impact and you have a drastic responsibility within that space. And because you have the potential to be one of the first people on there and one of the trendsetters and one of the people that actually mold the trends that go forward, really putting that message forward and making it something that is important and represented. But it needs to be looked at the total balance of the situation of individualizing profits and risk and the socializing profits and risk, and how we choose to balance that, and how innovation is actually fostered by individuals and how that affects the whole public. I'm not saying I necessarily have the right answer, but I think just the act of going through the thought process is important. And obviously I came to the conclusion that I think it's worth pursuing as a general public good with the antithesis in mind. But that's just me engaging in this paradox that there really is no right answer to. But it's this balancing act as we move forward as a culture that really has a drastic impact on us all, because it is this universal ethical problem that is worth engaging in and worth discussing. As you can tell, just in the core things that affect the topology of creativity as a whole, it's stuff that I just found super interesting naturally. So I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did making it. Like, this is just stuff I enjoy talking about. So thank you very much for listening. And I hope it kind of gave a look into like how I'll be approaching ideas. And even with other guests, I just want to look at kind of a problem or a paradox and just kind of like look at a problem, necessarily then specifically comment on like concrete thoughts on it. Yes, I'm going to share my opinion because I think it's important just to even go through the exercise, but I think it's more about the overall just conversation and the problems as philosophical problems to solve rather than just something that's specifically about a topic. So like I said, thank you for listening and have a good day.